Topic today will be the corporate social responsibility with this question: is CSR just another buzzword or a fundamental challenge of business models? To answer this question, I'm pleased to welcome you, Hans SCHLIERER, teacher at EMLYON and in the executive MBA also. And you teach the international negotiation skills and techniques at EMLYON, and your research focuses on CSR, especially the communication of CSR topics and the implementation of the CSR strategy. Thank you, Hans, and please let's dive into CSR.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to this presentation. Perhaps I should underline that I'm also a coordinator of CSR here at the school, which already reveals a certain approach how EMLYON is dealing with their own corporate social responsibility. Because compared to other schools, we have taken the decision not to create a particular CSR department or a dedicated CSR research institute. For different reasons, among others. First, it seemed to us that the message that CSR is something apart is not a good thing, because the questioning of the social and environmental impact of companies, of managerial decisions, is everywhere. It's in all the disciplines. And we wanted also to avoid what can sometimes happen, that when the question comes, do you deal with CSR? Oh, yeah. Ask Hans. He's the specialist. He knows everything. I don't even know what exactly this means or what is. So in order to avoid this, we have decided to have colleagues in all disciplines dealing with these topics, means the social and environmental impact. Because for us, it makes no sense to teach today supply chain management without taking these questions into considerations. But okay, human resources with the social impact, it's obvious. But also, for instance, finance or marketing. You have seen Lionel Sitz, by the way, about, is marketing dead, or do we need now to rechange the objectives of what marketing is? And you have, by the way, then seen Peter Wirtz about sustainable governance, okay, in the governance department. You have seen the first one was Thomas Gauthier about future perspectives in the strategic department. Lionel sits in the marketing and so on. So it means there are colleagues in all our disciplines dealing with these topics. But if you don't have a CSR department, you need someone who coordinates among faculty, between faculty and programs, but I deal also with, for instance, stakeholders like students. Just as an information at EMLYON, all student associations have one person in particular in charge of what is the social and environmental impact of what the student association is doing. So whatever they do, if they deal with arts, with sports, with like the Petit Paumé, with then the city guide in Lyon, they have to think about these dimensions. And this is then my role, also in coordination with the school management or with Benedict Bost, who is director of the CSR department and sustainability department of the school. So this is already then one thing which explains also how we approach this topic. Now, before coming to a short definition, it means also that you have understood CSR is everywhere. Means every participant, especially in a program like Executive MBA, has to deal with these questions. But participants come from different sectors, different companies, different departments. Means they all have potentially different questions, different approaches, but also then perhaps different examples to share. And the CSR class here in the school is very clear an peer-to-peer learning interactive class. And I never go in with a pre-formatted slideshow considering that I know what people should know in different companies, sectors, businesses, what they should think about this topic. No, this goes just the other way around. Means to be clear for those who project perhaps to join the Executive MBA program, my first thing is just with a paperboard and a pencil to say, what do you want to know more, understand better, or what you can share as best practices around the topic of social and environmental impact. And I challenge you, this masterclass also, I have no slide. And I challenge you to ask as early as possible questions. And let's try also to have an interactive masterclass online, which is a little bit weird format. And normally my other colleagues have worked with a lot of slides. I will try to make it the other way around. So please don't hesitate. Natalie will then be asked at different occasions if there are already questions, and then I will answer to it if possible, or discuss this with you, share my opinion or my question marks also, because CSR is dynamic, is changing. This also is an additional reason why I hesitate to bring formatted knowledge in a situation where we know that questions today are not the questions we had asked yesterday and will not be the questions for tomorrow. Answers we find today will probably not be the right answers tomorrow. This changes. All the social environment changes, in particular now in a situation where everybody knows that what we have learned in the past is probably not what will help us to overcome things in the future. Okay, and Thomas Gauthier has certainly changed with you some of these aspects and skills, what we need in terms also of systems thinking and so on. So this is part and also of this CSR approach. So whenever you have a question, come up with it.
I have a question.
Yes.
I would like to make the link with Thomas Gauthier and
Good.
to know the difference between sustainability and CSR.
Very good. It's interconnected. Sustainability is just another word. It focuses much more on the timeline for the future. That's the reason why Thomas is dealing with this. Whereas CSR is really what is happening today, but in a strategy and policy, it's also what do we do in 1 year, in 5 years, in 3 years, in 10 years. Okay, so it's interconnected. It's one part of the reflection we have in the CSR topics. Think, for instance, about green responsible investment. Okay, typically the timeline for investors traditionally is what? Return on investment within 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. At latest, after 5 years, investors go out in order to have the jackpot. Sustainable impact investing, they deal with another timeline. They invest on a longer scale. They want to follow and make business then really sustainable, okay, from this side. So it's interconnected. It's part of the reflection which is integrated in the CSR area also, okay? Which is, by the way, then for participants to know, the construction of the red thread in the executive MBA program, where with Thomas, this starts more on a, let's say, macro level with the perspective to the futures, so sustainable aspect, whereas then CSR is focusing on corporations, what they can do, but what is the current challenge based on perhaps the understanding of past dynamics, which we will explain in a couple of minutes. And then we have a last element of this, which is Alain Farjean, which works then on what is the individual responsibility for individual managers within a system. And this is, there are two red threads, it's leadership and CSR, which goes across all courses, but these are the three, let's say, keystones, milestones for the CSR in the executive program. Okay. Answers your question, Nathalie?
Do you have some questions in the chat? Do we have? Yes.
Yes.
Dear Hans, like the example of Danone in Bangladesh, do you have other disruptive business model with a good balance between business and CSR?
This is a question of examples. Okay, good. Yes, there are many examples. I will come answer to this question in a moment, but I would like to share perhaps first that we define precisely what we are talking about. So it's interrelated with sustainability. But first of all, CSR is based on social impact, environmental impact, based on the triple bottom line. PPP. People, profit, planet. Or planet, people, profit. You can put it in which order you want. Nowadays, we also talk not about profit, but prosperity, because the idea of shared value creation, and not only profit, is the current status of the reflections, how we deal with these topics. But definitely, CSR it goes never against, for instance, profit. All three dimensions needs to be balanced, needs to be integrated. And this is then the challenge where the company puts the cursor and how much these topics are interrelated. But no company can survive without generating profit. Very clear. Even, for instance, impact investing funds, which have another timeline, come back to your question, and select companies in a different way in order to have disruptive business models. They also need to generate profit. They have lower margins. Okay, they reduce what they expect, and they are sometimes also calculating other values, non-financial values they expect to have back from their financial investment. This also makes it very complex. Okay, so means the PPP, very important. And a second reference we use here at the school, which is an international reference, are the SDGs, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, okay, agreed on in 2015 and called the Agenda 2030, okay, because the initial title of the SDGs was 17 Goals to Save the Planet in 2030. Natalie, you immediately, as other participants also realized, this was quite exogenous. And so they changed the formula. Now it's 17 goals to improve the world, our world. But still, it's goal-oriented, action-oriented, and 195 countries are engaged in these objectives. 2015, timeline 2030. We all know that only one company worldwide has for the moment achieved the targets fixed, only one country. All others are out of the scope, means time is running and it's only 7 years left.
Which country?
And this is Costa Rica. Okay, a small country which for different reasons has a very sound environment policy for a very long time. They're very keen on it. But just the signal is we are all lacking behind, so there is need for action. Need for action also for corporations. Okay, and this is one of the elements also why the CSR class is not focusing only on knowledge, but on actions, on sharing examples, like disruptive business models. Coming to this, there is for me a huge difference between major companies, long existing companies. They have difficulties to deal with disruptive business models because they have invested in their traditional business so heavily that it's not easy for them to change. Whereas younger companies, startups, they can start from scratch, integrating disruptive ideas and working with these in order to develop then innovative business models not seen. Okay. And for this, there are many, many examples of startups. I recently, for instance, visited with international MBA students, companies in Berlin. And we had, for instance, a company which is called Clean Hub. And they start from the pure fact that plastic is the biggest pollution of our oceans. And what comes into the oceans very often is on land mills, but which are in third world countries or countries which cannot really protect these. And then they, through rain, through other elements, go into the ocean. And Clean Hub has an interesting business model. They target non-recyclable plastic in order to make money out of something you cannot recycle. And this, for instance, is a very disruptive idea. They work with many people then in countries like India, Bangladesh, and so on. They respect all social rules in order to prevent child labor, to give really salaries, to improve environmental conditions, living conditions in these countries. And this, for instance, is a very interesting business model. Other examples. Historically, we could say, for instance, there are, just to take one, like Interface. Interface was the first company for floor covering and carpets. They changed, and I said, in order to reduce our the linear production model, we produce, we sell, and then it's waste. They tried to have this as a circular model, so they changed completely their way. You buy, but you rent your carpet. Means lifelong, you can replace your carpet, they take it back. But through this circular economy, and then they repair it, and they relaunch it. Only through this they have reduced their initial raw material consumption and energy consumption by 80%, 85%. Okay, so it was a brilliant idea where they thought the whole line of how they relate production and customers in a circular model. These are disruptive ideas, but otherwise every company is challenged to do so if it's not in a business model itself, but inside perhaps departments, how they can deal differently or better with this. I have then perhaps other examples. But okay, fine. I hope I have answered to this.
2 more questions. How CSR could be launched when we are not a big company? Who's in charge? The CEO, or it's better to hire a dedicated person?
Good. Very good question.
How to coordinate?
How to coordinate. In general, if CSR is not implemented in the top management, in the governance, it's the first point which as a consultant makes me hesitate if there is a real coherent CSR strategy and policy. So it's the first element to see that in the corporate governance structure, that there is a clear shared value approach about what the company's targets are, how we deal with this, and what are strategic goals. That's the reason, by the way, why finance institutions today, so investors, banks, and so on, auditors, focus on ESG. The ESG factor means E for environmental, S for social, which is normal, but G for governance. Because that's what financial institutions want to know. Is there a real coherent implementation on a board level which guarantees that the CSR strategy announced is also implied in the company? But also, think about back, if you have attended it from Peter Wirtz, in the governance structure, it's the first element where we can integrate stakeholders. Okay, means first implied stakeholders. And you know there are different models. Okay, but for instance, the Nordic model in Sweden or in Germany implies mandatorily in the supervisory boards delegates from employees, from workforces. Means there are then representatives from labor unions and so on, which is in France, for instance, a no-go for people who know the French environment. But it's a different system. It doesn't matter. But here we have a first stakeholder, employees, integrated in the supervisory board who names and controls management. And immediately the questioning and how this is monitored, the policy changes. But I know also companies who integrate, for instance, critical NGOs. Greenpeace is invited in some companies to sit in the board, okay? Or other stakeholders, which then can enrich and enlarge the reflection what you do with regard to the social impact and environmental impact in terms of dialogue with stakeholders. This is for all companies, the same thing. It's for a startup also. If the company owner or the business associates, partners, are not clear about what are our values and what are then what is our CSR strategy, what we want to do, what is the business model we want to develop. If this is not integrated here, then it will not be shared within the rest of the company, how big the company is or how small. Doesn't matter. It's a process. To answer precisely to this, if you are interested in how this can work, look up to the ISO 26000. ISO, International Standard Organization, based in Geneva. And they have developed a lot of norms and standards, which probably you know in your business environments. 26,000, you cannot be certified by this norm because it's a kind of meta norm which gives in a 7-step approach how to implement a coherent CSR strategy and policy. And without any surprise, Natalie, it starts with governance. And the second thing is human rights. Because here it goes to we have to define what are the fundamental rights, values we define as being important in our company. And human rights means, in a large sense, how we deal with this topic. Because otherwise, especially for international companies, you will be confronted with so many challenges. If you have not a coherent approach based on some fundamental values shared in the company, you will find then, okay, some elements here, but they might be contradictory and there is no coherence in the strategy. And then the ISO 26000 norm goes later on, how to tackle with working conditions, employees, with environmental issues, but also how to guarantee the coherence of it and how to work then with a larger ecosystem in which all companies are involved in. Okay, so hopefully I answered to the question. Yes, and for me it makes no difference. Makes it sometimes perhaps easier for smaller companies, but not necessarily. I had recently exactly the opposite, that smaller investors have not CSR really on their radar, whereas institutional investors all today think about ESG factors, about risk factors, which they take if they integrate also then the governance structure as investors and what they will be confronted with. And they clearly challenge much more companies today about these issues, because we know all bankers and investors, just a stereotype, are risk avoiders. Means they see if you don't have a coherent CSR policy today, it's a major risk. And there are daily examples of if there is a corporate scandal about social impact on environmental impact, this can destroy companies, or at least it destroys billions for investors. And they want to avoid this. So, once again, that's why I don't think it's appropriate to share a slideshow, because every company has to ask within its own environment how to deal with this. But the first point is always, how is this dealt on a governance level?
Okay. Another question, dear Hans, is the weight of the planet pillar often more taken into account than the social people one? Why? I would a little bit moderate the question. This is a phenomenon today, because currently the environmental issues are so obvious that it starts to be the first place. But historically, in the 90s or the early 2000s, if you think back also to some scandal, it was much more about working conditions, still in recently in Rana Plaza or in others about working conditions in the textile industry. So historically, there's a higher focus perhaps on the social impact than on the environmental impact. But let's be clear, it's PPP. They are interrelated. You cannot disconnect. But currently, companies and also public scrutiny is more oriented towards the environmental issues, because sometimes they are more salient. They are more urgent. And perhaps also that companies feel a little bit more disarmed with regard to environmental topics than they are with regard to social topics. Okay? But for me, it's always linked, and it would be a mistake to focus too much on only environmental issues. Nevertheless, it makes it sometimes easier to deal with these, because what is the current hype? It's CO2 emissions. And CO2 emissions, they have the advantage, it's easy. You just count it, and then you have your balance sheet. Whereas with social issues, how to measure employee satisfaction, for instance, how to measure and to concrete your social impact, much more complicated, much more challenging. And since we are all lazy bones, let's assume this, it's a natural tendency to say, yeah, then we put forward that we have spent less energy, less waste, and so on. We can measure it, we can put tons in it, and so on. It's easier, but both work together. And historically, we had more the reflections about the social impact. Okay. We we have another question.
Perfect.
Yes.
That's
Dear Hans, when implement a CSR and decarbonization strategy, how do you engage all the stakeholders? Or do you lead the change and show that is the right way for the company's survival?
wow, very good. It's the right way. Okay, that's then the stakeholder dialogue. The first, and it's twofold. The first problem is to engage your first stakeholders in the company means the rest of employees. This is, depending on the size, very often the first challenge companies face. That perhaps it's only sticking on a top level and it's not shared and not lived within the company. So the first thing very clear, which you should, and that's why ISO 26000, the third step is focusing then on employees, on the working conditions, where you need to engage people in your CSR policy, in your CSR strategy. This is then also a tremendous process. Companies are very often surprised how many creative ideas come from employees when you engage them, when you stick them to how can we change this, how we can change this. Because very often they are on the job. They know what is going wrong or what could be changed and what could be have less negative impact, but also more positive impact. So it comes back also to disruptive business models. It's not only the business model in itself. It can sometimes be practices which can change many things and have a huge impact. Okay? There are different examples where then you can really rely on the creativity of the people if they are engaged, and it's surprising what kind of energy you have in companies. It's, by the way, one of the surprises that many Sociétés à Mission, B Corps, have. So we have now more than 500 in France, because they have to engage in a process, in a structured process, their employees. And very often they are really surprised about how positive ideas, creative ideas come up within the company. So this is one aspect, main stakeholder within the company. And then the huge difficulty is to identify other stakeholders. Stakeholders, just to remind, so people or organizations which are impacted by the company and its deeds, or vice versa, impacting the company. Okay, and here starts then where every company needs first to identify which are our major stakeholders and how we engage with them the dialogue. Sometimes creative examples in some businesses, for instance, with consumers. There is, for instance, in sports, sometimes co-creation with consumers. They are very carefully listening to their consumers and co-develop sometimes products. In other businesses, much more complicated to focus on consumers, whereas you have then perhaps other salient stakeholders, which could be also competitors, okay? Creative ideas. Just to share with you, concrete thing, transportation, Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk, the two biggest companies for maritime transportation. They realized that, for instance, in the Hamburg port, that frequently one ship from Hapag-Lloyd leaves only half filled because they have to deliver, but they have not enough clients which fills up the boat. And on the other side, at the same moment, another ship from Maersk, which is also only half filled. Okay, they, as competitors, worked together in order then to combine and to say, okay, then let's agree on that we have then only one ship. This is now full, and we can then get coordinate between things with competitors with a triple benefit: less money, increased transportation capacities, and less pollution. So it means these are simple examples where we can, through the identification and the dialogue with stakeholders, and competitors are also stakeholders, you can increase perhaps your positive impact or decrease the negative impact you might have. And these are then the two things. First, think about what is happening with our main first stakeholder employees, how we engage them, how they are involved. And then second, how we integrate the dialogue with other stakeholders. Key issues.
Okay.
Very interesting.
No more question for the moment.
No more questions?
No.
Good. Then let's perhaps rapidly go back to where does this start and why today CSR is unavoidable, whatever a company is doing, whatever answer they bring to this, and how seriously they deal with this. And participants who have attended the first masterclass with Thomas Gauthier will be surprised that I also, which is in the link, jump back into the 70s. The 70s is an interesting decade for different reasons. First, we have a series of scandals which puts the finger on production conditions or other wrongdoings by companies. Okay, very briefly, 73, for instance, Nestle baby killers, milk powder in Africa. Okay, you find a lot of information about this, but I make you a short story about this because it shows for me how you can naively apply all the rules of a marketing manual and create a disaster. Because what the marketing managers from Nestle in charge of milk powder did in Vevey, based in Geneva, they just reacted to a given fact. Because what happened in the early 70s in Europe, milk powder market is shrinking for different reasons, social evolutions, the pill, ladies want to have babies but a little bit later and not 4 or 5 children anymore, but perhaps only 1 or 2. So it means the whole market is shrinking. If you look up in the column, what do you do if your home market is shrinking? Either you diversify or you look for other markets. Means Nestle marketers apply it, look for other markets. What did you find? Africa. In Africa, high birth rates, even increased birth rates given historical, let's say, contextual factors given to then post-colonial, so freedom of post-colonial things, new optimism on the African continent. So increasing figures. What do you do? They go there. What do you read? How to develop a market if you are unknown, because milk powder was unknown. You promote it. Where do you promote it? Where you have potential customers. Maternities. How to credibilize your product. You dress your selling people in white, fainting that there are medical stuff that is backed up by medical, and you give it for free. Yes, that's marketing thing. Good. It's what they did. What happens if once you started to use milk powder? As a lady, your natural milk production stops. Means once you leave the maternity and you go back in Africa then to the countryside, because very often this is what happens, you still need milk powder, because in marketing we call this public captif, public captors. You might think this is cynical, but it's written in the manuals. It's just ideas. So then women need to have milk powders. But how do you get milk powder? Yeah, for the marketing specialists in Vevey, not a problem. You cross the street, as French President Macron said, and you get it. Okay, you can buy it everywhere. On African countryside, where you have it. So first problem was distribution. Second problem, it was distributed for free. Now you have to pay for it. Can you afford it? Second problem. And third problem, what do you need for milk powder? Water. And what is first? Water is a rare resource in Africa and not always available in proper ways. So you have to then clean the water up. Nowadays it's not a real problem because you have these small chemical pills. In the 70s it was not the case. So mostly you have to warm up water. How do you warm up water? With wood. Is wood widespread in African countries? No. So women hesitated between doing this and feeding perhaps the rest of the family. So an additional problem, okay? And also, so means the combination of bad, let's say, production conditions with water quality, but also if you run out of milk powder or you have not so much milk powder, what can you do? yeah, you reduce it's still white. It's a little bit like the pastis for the French people, okay? It depends, the color depends not on the size of the pastis, which in it, it's a natural combination. The same thing. Means babies were also starving, underfed by this, okay? And we talk here about many, many children. I hate these kind of, let's say, balance sheets, but we talk about millions of children dying in an African continent, okay? And that's the reason why Nestle was then attacked by activists as baby killers. But the marketing people in Vevey, they had no intention to kill babies. Makes no sense. But here you can see, applying some rules without contextualizing can bring and create disaster, which is until today the big challenge with CSR, corporate social responsibility. One corporation, but perhaps confronted to many social contexts, okay? And some big companies, let's name it, for instance, Total, I work with Total, they are present in more than 115 countries. So different countries such as Mongolia, Norway, Nigeria, Philippines, and whatsoever. Means they have to adapt to very different social environments. The problem is, Nathalie, that very often, like Nestle, they know what is happening on their home market. They know very well what's happening in Swiss and in neighbor countries, but they had no clue how this will work in an African country, how this will work perhaps in an Asian, Latin American context. And this is then a key issue. Coming back to the question, by the way, also for the stakeholders, stakeholder identification. If you enter an unknown social context, how to engage in you will have difficulties already to identify which are important stakeholders, how are they organized, and how we do have to deal with them. Okay, so it's up to date. One, as I see it, additional key challenge for big companies, but we have nowadays also family-run companies who are present in many different environments, and this is then a real challenging issue. Okay.
Thank you. Another question: what do you think about bringing a CSR strategy by the CSRD standard and not by the raison d'être?
Could you repeat the question?
What do you think about bringing a CSR strategy by the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive standard and not by the raison d'être?
There's a clear differentiation. The reporting standards are for reporting standards. Okay, it's for communication. Whereas la raison d'être is something you have to define within the company, where you need to engage all the people. So it means, for me, this is the first step before then communicating what is happening in the company. And with reporting standards, whatever you take, you can take also the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, which is the most used, but currently there are now European regulations, CRSD. So formerly it was the non-financial reporting standards, now it's the sustainable corporate reporting standards since early this year. Whatever standard you use, you can just tick the boxes and it's not correlated to what the company is really doing. So a reporting standard in itself is worthless. You can use them as a company in order to challenge your policy and your CSR strategy, because there are perhaps topics in a reporting standard where you have not thought about, or where you think, do we really do this or not? But in itself, for the implementation of a CSR strategy, I don't believe in it. It's, by the way, to add the same thing with labels. A label in itself means nothing. First, there are many labels out of it in the world. You can use so many labels. And second, you can just use it in order to tick the boxes and claim to do it. But in reality, there's perhaps a gap between what you claim to do and what you do, which is, by the way, a danger, because the first to realize it are employees. But I would dissociate and would say, no, for the implementation, raison d'être, or the definition of this, like in the ISO norm, the second step, defining the basic values, which is the raison d'être and nothing else in what you do. This is the key issue, okay? Yes. Which is then also sharing and creating shared value. Okay, for me important, and as you mentioned, I dived into this topic coming from the communication side, and this is always then the difficulty that companies think once they have communicated, that's it. No, it's not. It's changing project, but you can use also then a label in order to challenge your own policy. You know, to say where are we good, where aren't we good, and perhaps just to add. Very clear, there is no bad company, no good company. All companies have their challenges, okay? And for instance, if we take one of the currently most challenging labels, which is the B Corp label, already the founders of the B Corp label, okay, where you can be certified with, they know that no company will ever get the 200 points which are in the label, okay? And just as a contextual factor, you need to have 80 points plus in order to be certified B Corp. You can, as a company, engage in the process. Information is free out there, and you can challenge yourself. And the majority of companies who do so, they turn around 50, 60 points, okay? But if you want to be labeled, then you have to pay in equation to your turnover, but then you should normally be certain that you can do it. But this is just to underline, even a B Corp in itself, for me, it's not the important thing. It's not to have this and then fall asleep. It's to challenge through a labeling process your own strategy and saying, what do we do today? Where we are good? Where could we improve, and where we are not so good, where we should improve, and how to deal with this. But it's an ongoing process because, as I said, it's dynamic. Next year, new challenges. Okay, and we have all lived this in human resources with the COVID crisis. Questions and topics in human resources before the COVID crisis, afterwards, has relatively fundamentally changed with regard to working conditions and so on. And the younger generation today challenges all companies if they say, yeah, could we not just work for 4 days and 1 day only in presence and the rest at home and so on. So it has completely changed the scope.
As a CSR consultant, how do you manage projects that are in essence not sustainable? How do you take the issue in order to convince the client to not to take the option that maximizes his profits?
No, I can challenge them, okay? And if they come to me, then mostly they have the intention to do good, but they don't know how, okay? But it's not that I bring let's say, the stone of wisdom, and I have the nice baguette magique, as we call it, in order to transform them. I can challenge them and can ask critical questions. I can, secondly, give them perhaps advice where they can find approaches, information, how to deal with them. I can help them with the process. But the solution itself must come from them. And then my first question is, if this is a particular project, for instance, what is the backup institutional-wise for this project? Because once again, I go back, if it's not shared on a governance level, makes no sense. Then it's an isolated activity which has perhaps a positive impact, but it has no impact of the company and it has no major impact of in the whole company. Which happens, okay? I already had companies which, for historical reasons, family-run company. The owner of the company from the family had always social things on the top. They made a real tremendous policy already in the 80s and so on. But since it was only impulsed by the company owner and not shared, not even in the management structure, what did I realize when I came in as a consultant? Yeah, you had some activities here, some activities there, other activities here. Nobody was aware of any coherence. And there was overall no CSR policy and no shared. When I ask on a coffee machine, how do they deal with this? Then very often I don't know. But I've heard about, yes, they deal with bees, I think, in the department, try to get this. So nobody was really aware and there was no real impact. So this is then as a consultant where I say, no, let's properly work and I can challenge you. But afterwards, it's up to you to engage in the process, because I will be there for a certain time. But you want to work sustainability. Means you have to import something which lasts longer than only one project. So that's my way of how I approach this. I don't see myself as just give packages in order to hide wounds or current problems. With CSR sustainability, we have to work, or companies should work, on what they really want to change fundamentally in this. And that's, if you take then CSR seriously, it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge of business models. It's a challenge of how we do this. How do we find then creative ideas of doing things differently? So change also our mindset. That's then a serious thing. And then it's, and otherwise, if I realize that a company is just seeking for something typically in greenwashing to finally put forward something and to hide other things, then I'm out. It's not what I'm doing. They can do it, and there are other people who, and I don't criticize them. It's not my way of doing. And here I'm very clear. These are my values, where as a consultant I will not enter into this.
To which extent is corporate philanthropy, charitable contributions, a part of CSR strategy? I wonder if it is a way to give oneself a good conscience and to hide somehow CSR lack of actions. Sorry.
Can be, yes, definitely. It's for me, it's an iceberg. If you look to it, philanthropy is then linked to foundations, for instance, foundation fundings, or the private spending from rich entrepreneurs, which they do so. If it's in a coherent CSR strategy, which then integrates the corporation, perfect. If it's just the only activity, very often it's disconnected from the corporation. As I said, this is then philanthropy. It's what Warren Buffett is doing, what Bill Gates is doing, and so on. But this has nothing to do with Microsoft. It's not engaging the corporation. Okay, it's typically, by the way, coming back to Thomas Gautier, when we come back to the 70s, it was Milton Friedman said, very clear. The sole responsibility of companies is to increase its benefits. But he clearly dissociated and said, yeah, but as a private person, you have the right and you can do whatever you want to do in order to spend your money. You can give it back to the society, which allowed you to become rich. And this is one of the approaches a lot of American billionaires are doing. But for me, this is not corporate social responsibility. It can be part, but it must be always then linked to what the whole organization is doing. Okay, otherwise it's very clear. Greenwashing, or it's disconnected from the company and has no impact on the company.
Perhaps the last question. Once CSR
I
don't know. I say. Once CSR become more strategic again, considering technological revolution, transformation, and business model disruption ongoing, how to more value it, make it an asset for building culture and fueling innovation above communication and reputation strategies, or how to use it to better evaluate impact or better manage innovation usage framework, example with intelligence artificial.
Okay.
A lot of questions in the question.
A very complex question,
yeah.
Which includes, for instance, the definition of KPIs. This is a key relevant question for the whole discussion in CSR, which is then coming back to Milton Friedman and neoliberalism. Why is this still today the main mindset we keep in mind and use it? Because it's relatively, as I said previously, easy. You know the KPIs, you know there's a monetary values or other values, you can put them into balance sheets, full stop. Whereas if it comes to how to measure and how to have KPIs for social values, environmental impacts, and so on, it's much more complicated. It's, by the way, typically what currently green finance is fighting with. Because green finance is nothing else with sustainability. I invest today money and I get back tomorrow perhaps better working conditions, better water quality, air quality, and so on. So I come from my investment today, I will get possibly other values back. But how to measure these and how to define perhaps KPIs we want to have, we want to target, a real challenge for every single company. And this includes, I think, for this question, and not artificial intelligence, which brings us out of this. Because first of all, there is no intelligence in artificial intelligence. It's human created, and it just repeats things, and it has a high frequency of treating already existing information. Okay, but in itself, it's not innovative. It's not creating something new. It's just combining. Even ChatGPT is not bringing something new. It's just an intelligent into brackets, way of sorting something out of what is already existing. So that's in itself doesn't bring us out. And we have colleagues here at the school, they think very much about this. The impact of new technologies on a social level, terrible. Okay. That's even on a poster. If you look now to youngsters, you can see, and we have the first difficulties with this. Regardless, then how these items consume energy, how often they are changed. It's also a throwaway sector, and how they are produced. And we know nowadays with raw materials, this might or is already getting a serious problem. So in itself, technology is, it's my point of view, does not bring us out of this. It's that we reconsider how we deal with this, and what is the final objective of having these items, which makes life easier, very clear. But we need also to realize that it makes some issues much more complicated. And with a high increase, already more than 4% of all energy consumption is linked to these new technologies. Okay. Not only in electricity, but also in heat production and in other items. I think these were two elements in the question, which was a little bit complicated, so perhaps not.
I have no more question for the
No more question?
Yes.
Where are we in the time rapidly? Wow.
Almost 1 hour, yeah.
Almost 1 hour. Time runs fast. What could I and it's very good having all these
perhaps
interesting
some words to
questions.
conclude.
Yes, perhaps today. So clearly, you have understood CSR is not a buzzword. It's current requirement for companies to think about it. Okay, and some companies take this on a defense situation. Why not? I would turn it around and say, what can we do in order to positively position ourselves with new ideas, creative ideas, with increasing our impact, or even nowadays thinking about repairing economies. Examples which were asked, for instance, in Berlin, you have UREF, which is a platform, private platform, thinking and working about electricity, new ways of dealing with electricity, but other energy sources also. It's a private initiative. More than 100 companies are located on the spot, and very reputed companies, but they are keen on working on this, collaborating on this. The site in itself, for instance, is completely energy independent. Even better, they produce energy, they sell energy. And they are currently now on a net zero emission carbon level, but they're thinking about how perhaps to capture as a next step then carbon. And this, for instance, is for me a good example of how you can have a disruptive idea of an industrial side which is completely autonomous, which is the future with regard to buildings, with regard to locations, and then also perhaps repairing economy, which captures, which has a positive impact on the environment. And there are many examples out it, but today companies should think about what can we do also to attract talents, because the more and more young people are asking for this. Not all young people are Greta Thunbergs, but more and more put other values before just getting a job and earning money. And companies now feel it when they are confronted with questions from youngsters where they normally have not dealt with this. But you can also position yourself differently towards competitors. You can more integrate positively consumers, other stakeholders. Also create perhaps combined efficiency, like the Hapag-Lloyd and the Maersk example, between competitors or between companies. What is waste for one can be already raw material or a resource for another company. If they can combine, they can create a microcosm which is then beneficial for everybody. And this is then shared value creation. And currently I see many companies who work with this, and this makes me rather positive. And that's where I would like to contribute also to. And where we share then in our CSR classes here at EMLYON then also best practices in order to inspire. And sometimes best practices are simple ideas, but you need to have them. And sharing these brings then also the whole thing, discussion forward in the right direction. Okay. No more question?
I think no.
Perfect. Then I thank very much the audience for so many questions.
You.
And I hope this was just an inspiring teaser for then keeping on the discussion exchanges, and hope to see you soon, either in EMLYON or in other networks.
Thank you, Hans. It was very, very interesting, a masterclass that allowed us to dive into the executive MBA. And don't mix the next and last episode of this series of masterclass on June 22 with Agathe Potel with the topic of leadership.
Yes.